Hello, everyone. My name is Brett Steele, and I am the Senior Director of Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Thank you for joining us for the 6th workshop for the Emerging Prevention Practitioners Network. For this workshop, we will be discussing the threat of white supremacist and anti-government violence and strategies and tactics different community-based organizations are taking to prevent that threat and prevent individuals from engaging in acts of violence. The Prevention Practitioners Network will be a national network of interdisciplinary professionals dedicated to preventing targeted violence and terrorism and their impacts within the United States. We're currently seeking your guidance on how we will shape the Emerging Prevention Practitioners Network. So we will ask you to fill out a brief survey at the end of this workshop. Addie will provide the link in the chat box, and more information on how to join the professional network will be coming in the upcoming weeks and months. While we have been hosting these workshops virtually, and will continue to do so through the month of September, we are planning to host our first in-person workshop in Chicago later this fall, so we can finally meet one another face-to-face again after COVID. More information on this in-person workshop will be soon, along with information on our 3 remaining virtual workshops. For today's workshop, we have a fantastic panel of subject matter experts prepared to discuss both the threat landscape of white.
What the hell?
Brett, I believe that you've muted yourself.
She's muted.
Brett, you're muted.
Well, that's not good. Sure. All right, I will start again. Hello, everyone. My name is Brett Steele. I am the Senior Director of Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute. You would think this many months into COVID, I would learn to use it by now. Thank you for joining us today for our 6th workshop for the Emerging Prevention Practitioners Network. For this workshop, we'll be discussing both the threat of white supremacist and anti-government violence and promising practices to prevent white supremacist and anti-government violence that are being implemented by community-based organizations. The Prevention Practitioners Network will be a national network of interdisciplinary professionals dedicated to preventing targeted violence and terrorism and their impacts within the United States. We currently are seeking your guidance on how to shape this Emerging Prevention Practitioners Network. So we'll ask you to fill out a brief survey that Addie will go ahead and put in the chat box. More information on how to join this network will be coming in the upcoming weeks and months. While we have been hosting these workshops virtually and will continue to do so through the month of September, we're planning to host an in-person workshop in Chicago this month, and we cannot wait to finally see one another face-to-face again. For today's workshop, we have a fantastic panel of subject matter experts prepared to discuss both the threat landscape of white supremacist and anti-government violence and promising practices to prevent those threats. Each panelist will discuss this topic for roughly 7 minutes before we open the floor to audience discussions with each panel. We invite audience engagement for these open discussions, and we know it will make it that much more productive of a discussion. To make this workshop as interactive as possible, we do encourage audience members to turn on their cameras and use the chat function or raise their hands to queue up questions and comments. We're going to have a few too many people for me to see your hand raised, so go ahead and use that hand raise function in Zoom, or use the chat function to post those questions. All right. At the end of today's discussion, we will ask you to participate in a brief survey as we summarize lessons learned. And in order to effectively assess lessons learned from this workshop, we're going to ask you to participate in a brief survey now. Addie, can you go ahead and put up that pre-assessment poll?
Yes.
Ultimately, these workshops are put on to benefit you, interdisciplinary professionals working in the targeted violence and terrorism prevention space. We want to know how we can best serve you. So please feel free to contact us. Addie will put her email address in the chat so we can hear from all of you directly. Lastly, I want to thank our partners who have helped us make this event possible: the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, the Anti-Defamation League, and everyone on our steering committee, from the New York Citizens Crime Commission, Boston Community Connect out in Denver, and Adventure Partners, who we work so closely with on so many programs. Thank you to all of you. So please take a moment now and participate in our pre-workshop survey.
That was the last of the questions if you want to get started, Brett.
All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel. Our two panelists on this first panel are Dr. Heidi Barrick from the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, and Jacob Davey from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Heidi, please go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Brett, and thanks, Addie, and thank you to the entire network for having me here and your partners. I'm just gonna put up a slideshow, a short slideshow, so hopefully I'll do this right now for everybody to see. Okay, give me a thumbs up if this is working. Okay, thanks. All right, everyone. So my name is Heidi Barrick. I am a co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. For years, I worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center, tracking hate groups and extremists. I'm actually stealing some of the information of my colleagues who are there still for this discussion. And I'm just going to give a short overview of the main threats that I see in terms of what this network is interested in that we're facing right now, and some of the differences between the different extremist movements that are presenting at this point in time. You know, most of us think about what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th as, sort of the summit of our problems in the United States with extremism. But there were actually quite a few different factions that were at that event. And I think sometimes we don't disentangle those different types of extremism adequately. And I'm going to try to do a little bit of that today. First of all, we had white supremacists there. We also had members of anti-government groups, like the Oath Keepers or the Three Percenters. We had members of organizations that straddle some of these movements, that, like the Proud Boys, for example, that can sometimes present themselves as anti-government, and at other times, have spread different ideas of bigotry and racism. And then there were a whole lot of conspiracy theorists who were at the Capitol as well, in particular, QAnon conspiracy theorists. And I think as you all do your work, each of these movements has particularities to them and different things that you need to know in terms of the narratives they're spreading, their propaganda, what drives their activities, and so on. In fact, I thought that the materials that were distributed for this workshop this morning were really, really good at teasing out those different things and giving signs and symbols and so on. So let me start first with white supremacy. This is my colleagues at the SPLC's map for 2020 and in terms of hate groups across the United States. My experience at the Southern Poverty Law Center has been over the last 20 years that the number of white supremacists and groups motivated generally by either anti-Black, anti-Islam, anti-immigrant beliefs have been on the uptick in this country for about 20 years. And for the most part, these organizations have been reacting to changing demographics. In other words, if you're a white supremacist, you're having existential panic over the fact that our society is changing demographically. There are more people of color, more immigrants, and so on. And that is the basic narrative that underlies the rise of white supremacy in the United States, and also, frankly, in quite a lot of other countries. In fact, one of the most popular propaganda ideas that is spreading and is behind many of the terrorist attacks that have occurred in recent years, like the attack at the El Paso Walmart, for example, or the Christchurch, New Zealand mosques, is something called the Great Replacement. And what the Great Replacement argues is that there's a conspiracy to displace white people from their home countries, or what they view as their home countries, with immigrants, non-white immigrants. Oftentimes, this particular theory has an anti-Semitic spin on it. In other words, there's an argument made that Jews are behind the importation of people of color into historically white societies. In fact, the attacker at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue was actually trying to get to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society offices inside that building, because he viewed them as, Jewish interests working to dilute the white population by bringing in immigrants. So this map that you see here of hate groups, the number of hate groups have basically more than doubled since 2000. And the numbers have, deviated a little bit in the 900s, but it's more than twice what we had in the United States, frankly, when I started working at SPLC in 1999. This is the definition that the Southern Poverty Law Center uses for hate groups. I think it's important for people to understand what the term means. What the SPLC argues on this is that the organization, based on its official statements or principles, the activities of its leaders, has beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire group of people, typically for their immutable characteristics. So the idea here is that all Black people are bad, or all immigrants are bad, or all Muslims are bad. It's that categorization of an entire group of people as being problematic that drives the hate labeling. And SPLC doesn't use criminal conduct as a basis. So I know that this network is particularly interested in targeted violence, and some of these groups are more violent than others, such as those who are attached to the Great Replacement beliefs. Now, the number of these groups has more than doubled in 20 years, but their online networks and the nature of white supremacy are very different today. I think Jacob is most likely, I'm guessing, going to be talking a little bit more about this. but these are decentralized networks that rage over online platforms. And, people aren't necessarily card carrying members of extremist groups anymore. They're just signed on to Telegram channels and other places with people who share their beliefs and share the ideas that they have in terms of vilifying others. The last year, I just want to point a couple things out, has seen the rise of some particularly scary forms of white supremacy. This is a propaganda piece put out by a group called The Base, which the UK banned yesterday, actually. There are about a handful of organizations that are rabidly neo-Nazi. One of them is The Base, another, the Atomwaffen Division, which is sort of rebranded lately, and they're offshoots that are part of what we call the accelerationist movement. This is a relatively recent evolution in neo-Nazi organizations. And what they're accelerating towards, or hoping to accelerate towards, is the destruction of democracies and whole societies. And these organizations are particularly prone to violence. There have been lots of arrests involving members of these kinds of organizations, accelerationist organizations, for murder plots, terrorist attacks, and so on. And so I think when we're talking about the prevention of violence, we have to pay particular attention to accelerationist organizations. This is just a picture from after El Paso. I've already mentioned the power of the Great Replacement. I also want to point out that there's a parallel narrative to the Great Replacement ideas, which is called the white genocide theory. And it's basically a version of the Great Replacement, but you're going to see that language as well when you're looking at organizations. And if you have people talking to you about their fears about white genocide, what that relates to is the idea that the number of white people is shrinking drastically in a lot of Western societies, and there's a plot to wipe them out, to genocide them. What's worrisome about the white genocide theory, or that framing, is that if you put your victimhood in a genocide frame, it becomes very easy to justify the use of violence to stop those processes. And so people who believe in these ideas, believe that violence is completely legitimate because they're stopping a genocide, a war crime against their people. So it's something to keep in mind. So white supremacy is one part of extremist movements in the United States that are connected to violence. Another one, which often doesn't get the attention that it deserves, but was important in terms of the Capitol attack and also in terms of the Biden administration's recent plan to take on extremist movements, are anti-government groups. This is a very different kind of animal from white supremacist groups. In other words, their beliefs are very different. Their main focus isn't on white nationalism or white supremacy, although I would argue in recent years, these groups have become increasingly anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant. But what motivates anti-government groups are very different things. And there were a lot of these organizations at the Capitol attack. Some of them, in particular, members of the Oath Keepers, have been charged now with conspiracy and may have had something to do with orchestrating the attack. This is the definition that we created at the Southern Poverty Law Center for anti-government groups. The key thing is to understand that these groups see the federal government as the enemy. They are often motivated in particular by any attacks on Second Amendment rights. That's probably the main driver in the way this movement grows and shrinks over the years. They believe all kinds of baseless conspiracy theories about a new world order, the United Nations creating a global totalitarian government. There are various forms of this. And the anti-government movement is made up with heavily armed groups, militias, but also those who are basically involved in propaganda, pushing propaganda. It's usually the militia folks that we're more concerned about when it comes to targeted violence. Or perhaps one of the most bizarre extremist movements in the United States, maybe shy of QAnon, something called the Sovereign Citizens Movement, which is a subset of anti-government movements, been involved in a lot of violence, in particular targeting law enforcement, including murders. Sovereign citizens, literally believe that they don't have to comply with any laws in the United States. They don't believe that the federal government has any authority. They're not necessarily a movement just of white folks, as people might assume. Some of you might have seen the arrests last week of a group of Moorish citizens outside of Boston who subscribe to some of these same beliefs. And as I said, this is a movement in general that isn't necessarily motivated by racism. You might find strains of it, but their concerns are much different. An interesting thing about the anti-government movement is it tends to rise and fall based on the political party that is in power in the federal government. So under the Clinton era, we saw a huge rise in the number of these groups. Some of you might remember that Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, was interested in militias. And when George Bush came into office, this movement died down. And then when Obama came into office, this movement took off again. At one point, there were about 1,300 of these organizations. There aren't that many today. But there was a shift under Trump where anti-government and militia groups began to self-identify with Trump and view him as under attack with the federal government. And so the movement didn't shrink like it traditionally did under Republican presidents. In a way, the spasm of violence at the Capitol was the end result of that. And, everything bodes now, seems to be the case that now that Biden's in office, we will see more and more of these organizations, and they will probably be, extremely upset at the administration's efforts to deal with extremism domestically or to deal with anything having to do with gun control. There are some hybrid movements that have come out of the woodwork in the last year, particularly in reaction to the lockdowns that were imposed for COVID, and then sort of inciting of the anti-lockdown movement. I'm just going to point to one, the Boogaloo movement, which mixes at times accelerationist ideas, wanting a race war and so on, with anti-government ideas, and quite a few people involved in this movement, which is literally maybe 2 years old at most, have been arrested for violence. This is a picture of Las Vegas where 3 Boogaloo boys were arrested for trying to bomb BLM protests, but they also were involved in attacks on law enforcement in California, for example, to Boogaloo members who met on Facebook and within 24 hours killed 2 law enforcement officials. So it's something to keep in mind. It's quite a varied movement at this point in time. One last thing I'd like to talk about. So I've discussed white supremacy, the differences between white supremacy and the anti-government movement, and some of the more, problematic parts of those movements, like accelerationism, some of these hybrid groups like the Boogaloo Boys. But another big motivator of violence in this country are conspiracy theories. And probably the most popular is QAnon at this point in time. This is many people here are probably aware of this, but this is a conspiracy theory that alleges, Democrats are involved in a secretive cabal related to child trafficking and that Donald Trump is going to save us from this. It's a really bizarre set of beliefs. And it didn't exist at all until 2016, which is perhaps the most amazing part of it. But QAnon now has millions of adherents online and is a phenomenon that also has spread to other countries, interestingly. So there are QAnon believers in places like Germany and France and even Japan. And it's one part of the extremist networks in the United States that we have to be concerned about now, are conspiracy theories and their ability through the use of online spaces to motivate people very quickly to violence. All right, so I'll leave it there as a top level description of things to be worried about in the US when it comes to targeted violence.
Thank you very much, Heidi. We appreciate that overview. I know it's a huge topic to try to cover in just a few minutes. And next up, I want to turn to Jacob Davey. Jacob's with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Jacob, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Brett, and thanks so much for organizing this great event. Can I just get a quick thumbs up that you can see the slides? Fantastic. So actually, I think what I'm going to say dovetails quite neatly with what Heidi was talking about. I'm going to speak to some of the broader trends which we've been seeing, which relate to white supremacy, but I think also to those other connected or movements which Heidi spoke to. I'm going to be quite quick so we can get through to a conversation as well. I suppose, broadly speaking, to sort of underline this and looking at the threat from white supremacists, but also other racially and ethnically motivated groups, is globally, over the past decade, we have seen an increasingly empowered and violent set of what we would broadly describe as extreme right-wing movements, which incorporate white supremacist groups. Violence committed by these actors has surged by 250% in the past 5 years. And what we see is in the US, 57% of terrorist attacks between 94 and 2020 were committed by groups associated with the extreme right. We've also seen a surge in violent hate crimes. So in the US, 2019 saw the highest number of hate crimes in more than a decade. And we've seen similar trends in other European contexts and Canada as well. Obviously here, we could separate hate crimes slightly from, or separate hate crime out from white supremacist activity. Not everyone who commits a hate crime will be a white supremacist. But what I think this points to more broadly is the violent threat posed by intolerant and exclusionary movements, not just in the US, but internationally. Now, if we look at some of the trends which are behind this growth, and again, I think this relates to that whole cohort of actors which Heidi spoke to. Over the past decade, we have seen a transformation of this white supremacist and racially and ethnically motivated threat. What were once quite disparate groups have transformed into a transnational, highly tech-savvy community, which is deeply interlinked with online subcultures, and which quite specifically has the ability to translate online activity into offline violence. So we see mobilization around conspiracy theories, as Heidi said, or around specific threats online, which can spark off and spin off quite quickly into real world atrocities. Importantly, this threat has become increasingly hybridized. So what we're seeing is, looking at a range of online harms, is an increasing intersectionality between not only extremism and hatred, but also disinformation, conspiracy theories, and online harassment. This itself is being amplified both by hostile state, online information operations, but also more broadly by algorithmic amplification of hateful messaging on social media platforms. So what I'm talking about there is the business models which social media platforms are built around inadvertently facilitate and aid these movements by amplifying hateful content or divisive content online. The result of this transformation has really been sort of two key points which I come out. On the one hand, the mainstreaming of extremism, but also conspiracy theorist thinking, with these movements being able to enlarge their sphere of influence through the mass proliferation of online content, but also the internationalization of sort of nationalism. So really we're seeing these groups connect dots across borders. And through our analysis, which I'll speak to in a second, we've actually seen the US being one of the key exporters of this ideology globally. At ISD, we don't just look at this through US context, we look at this transnationally. So over the past 3 years, we've built a very large database of domestic extremist activity and hateful activity, not only in the US, but also in Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, and France. And what I really want to just hone in on here is where Heidi spoke to the differences between these groups. What we've also charted is the way in which these sort of slightly disparate, slightly competing, not always ideologically aligned factions come together around key moments. So particularly in the US, what we've seen is a wide range of exclusionary and hateful communities, including white supremacists, but also anti-minority groups, running through to conspiracy theorists, start to connect the dots across a broad ideological church. So coming together online, agreeing around certain conspiracy points, with the mean that although they're not necessarily a cohesive movement, there is interplay between these subsections. Now, these groups opportunistically coalesced around crisis points and share political goals. We saw this in Charlottesville and again in the capital. And I think importantly here, it's important to underscore that the threat of violence comes from across this broad ideological spectrum. It's not one or two very violent groups which are driving terrorist attacks or targeted violence. We're really seeing this threat coming from across a broad interconnected network of movements. The final point which I'm going to speak to is the emergence of what we call post-organizational terrorism and mobilization to violence. So as Heidi spoke to, where organization doesn't just come from a card-carrying group or a movement where you meet on the ground, but also loose, often online communities. So over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to try and keep to my 7 minutes time slot, so we have time for our discussion. I'm just going to sort very quickly to 2 research case studies, which I think bring this out. So firstly, post-organizational terrorism. And this comes from analysis which we did at ISD, analyzing white supremacist communities on Telegram. And hopefully this will allow you to unpick what we mean by post-organizational terrorism and violent extremism. So we looked at a network, an interconnected network of 208 Telegram channels associated with white supremacy. These are places where individuals come together to discuss white supremacist activity, but also violence, to share ideological material, to really discuss key talking points. And in an analysis of over 1 million posts, we found that the platform was consistently being used to glorify terrorism, call for violence, but also spread instructional material on how to commit attacks. Now, what was interesting about these networks was that this network was very few of these channels were actually affiliated with a specific group, like Atomwaffen, for example, but were more broadly just hubs for people to come together and discuss violence. Now, when we looked at this, and I'll explain this network map to make it a bit clear, what we found were there were 49, so about a quarter channels which was expressly promoting terrorism, 7 which were sharing tactical know-how. So this is how you commit an attack. This is how you improvise an explosive. But then a much broader cohort of groups which weren't necessarily violent, but which were sharing discussion around white supremacist ideology or promoting content such as propaganda material. Now, when we network these maps, and this is the sort of blotch of colors here, what we found was there was close interplay between these pro-terrorism channels and the non-terrorist groups. So the green nodes, which you can see here, those little green bubbles, those are channels which are advocating for terrorist violence. And the orange ones are channels which are more broadly promoting exclusionary white supremacist ideology. Now, the closer they are to the middle of this map, is the closer the closer connected they are to other channels. And the size of their node means that it relates to how much that content has been shared by other channels. And if you distill that, what you essentially find is that online, you've got these green channels, these pro-terrorism channels, which are closely interlinked with non-violent white supremacist ideology, which essentially means in the digital ecosystem, it's quite easy to get involved in non-violent extremist ideology and quickly hop into these spaces, not affiliated with any groups, but which nevertheless allow you to prepare for extremist violence. And I can come into this in more detail in the discussion if that's a little unclear. Next to the transnational piece, now I could go on about this for hours, so I'm going to be quite quick. I'm just going to give you a couple of things at a glance, which hopefully help you unpick this. Now, this first map is something which we drew out of a study we're just about to publish in Canada. I think we looked at nearly 3,000 channels associated with what we call the extreme right wing, including white supremacists, but also white nationalists and anti-immigrant groups. We mapped all of their online discussion, right? And then what we did was we applied some geolocation technology to that discussion. And that's shown in this heat map here. The darker the color, the more likely they were to be discussing a country. What we found in Canada was that Canadian extremists are actually more interested in what's going on in the US and more interested in US-based groups than they actually are in what's going on in their own backyard. So this is just sort of one snapshot which shows you that these groups aren't just looking at what's happening in their own country. They're not just concerned about immigration in their own country. They're just as concerned about what's happening elsewhere, which means that you have these flows of influence transnationally. So what happens in the US has great bearing on what happens in Canada, or great bearing about what happens in the UK. We've seen very similar trends in our analysis of Australian data and New Zealand data as well. Another very quick example, which I think points towards this transnational dynamic. And again, when I'm talking about transnationalization, I'm not talking just about individuals who are prepared to commit attacks traveling across borders. I'm talking much more broadly about this flow of influence. Now, Heidi explained really, really well the Great Replacement theory, but just to really point this out, this originated in France, right? It was quite a fringe piece of French philosophy associated with the new right. but it very, very quickly, sort of in a space of about 10 years, managed to spread out to be influential in extremist activity in the UK, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the US, and ultimately to inspire attack in New Zealand. So the thinking of these groups is spreading across borders as well. It's not just a case of sort of quite short-sighted, I don't like migrants in my backyard. They are creating a transnational philosophy. And I'll just leave on this, and this sort of shows you the volume of time discussing the Great Replacement theory on Twitter in the run-up to the Christchurch attack. Now, what I don't have is the visualization to show you this, but what we found is sort of running from April 2012, this was largely limited to European networks. But as the sort of time went on, the countries where people were talking about this sort of increased, spreading to the US, spreading to other English-speaking countries until we have the attack. So this just gives you an idea of how online communications is really, really influential in driving and facilitating the spread of this ideological content. Now, I've gone 3 minutes over, so I'm going to stop. I beg forgiveness there.
You are forgiven. So please, everyone, I know John is frantically typing 2 questions right now, but if you have questions, this is your chance. Please turn your cameras on and let's dive in with questions for Heidi and Jacob. All right, first question up. Can you speak to the role of manifestos in previous attacks in inspiring violence? For example, John shares Revik.
Well, I'm happy to. There's a direct link between the manifestos and almost the next attack, and then the next attack, and the next attack. What you'll find with the Christchurch shooters manifesto, much of those ideas were repeated, for example, in the Poway synagogue shooters manifesto. In other words, there's an unfortunate building up of more violence based on prior manifestos. I think that the New Zealand Prime Minister's efforts not to speak the shooter's name helped a little bit on tamping this down, and the quick moves to try to get, in particular, the New Zealand shooters manifesto offline as quickly as possible. But I don't see how we're not going to see more and more and more connected attacks sharing the same ideas, with the next manifesto spurring the next one. I don't know if you feel differently, Jacob, but that's certainly been the pattern now since Breivik, maybe earlier.
No, absolutely. I was nodding along there, Heidi. I think that this really ties into a core component, which is sort of the inspirational dynamic of attacks. These attacks aren't just committed as a means of advancing your goal, be that sort of the acceleration of the downfall of society or the more urgent need to kill minority groups, but also as a piece of sort of almost inspirational theatre for a white supremacist audience globally. And so when you look at the way in which attacks are mounted, yes, there's a manifesto document, but also there's been sort of the case of filming this in the case of the Halle attack in Germany or the New Zealand attack. These attacks are committed with the express intention of encouraging other people to follow in your footsteps. And I think that that's essential to this whole accelerationist piece, which Heidi spoke to. The idea being that, okay, your attack might not be the straw which breaks the camel's back, but if you inspire 10 others to follow up with you, eventually you're going to reach a sort of a crisis point where the fabric of society is going to start to collapse. And I really think that that's essential to this broader post-organizational dynamic as well. These groups talk about individuals who commit attacks as saints, right? So people refer to Saint Breivik. The idea being, okay, you don't have to be a member of a movement to be a member of a group to be hugely influential to the movement. So yeah, I think that they're sort of hugely important and a very deliberate part of this strategy behind driving white supremacist violence.
All right, our next question from John, and please others dive in. Sorry, I already lost it. Okay, John is speaking to the anti-government movements in particular. He's actually talking about white supremacists. There's also a lot of anti-government activity, British Columbia, Northern Idaho, and recognizing that oftentimes there's triggers for violence. And I always think of here, Bureau of Land Management activity with respect to grazing rights and how that can trigger So John's question is, what do we know about activities that can be taken that might lead individuals to feel persecuted? How do we know what government actions might backfire? And what, if any, steps can we take to prevent them? And I apologize if I bastardized a couple questions there.
Well, I'm happy to talk about the government issue here, actually. There's no question, and then this is not me criticizing the government, but there's no question that depending on how you handle certain situations, you can trigger worse outcomes. And there's a whole history of sort of problematic handling of white supremacists and extremists, especially up there in the Northwest. I'm thinking of the Weaver situation, for example, in which you have to be very careful of who you're dealing with and what motivations they have. If they're rabidly anti-government, you might want to take a lighter hand. I think law enforcement actually has learned a lot about this in the last couple decades. There were some standoffs that they dealt with very differently than in the 1990s in later years, when in New Hampshire with some anti-government activists and another person who I think is still confined to a ranch in Texas for like 30 years now. The other part of that question was also about sort of Canada and American movements. And I just think you can't separate the countries. I mean, Jacob's data showed what this looks like online, but in the real world as well, all the extremist movements, skinheads, anti-government, whatnot, that were active in the Northwest were active across the Canadian border. There wasn't a border, in other words, because they shared ideas. They're coming from the same place. They were working together. And this has been going on for actually quite a while.
Yeah, and if I can sort of pick up on our most recent data, which we've got from Canada as well, which I think speaks less to sort of individuals and individual ties, but much more broadly to the information ecosystem. And what we find there is there's absolutely sort of directions of influence between Canada and the US. This is both with regards to extremist groups, anti-government groups, white supremacist groups, looking at the policies and what's happening on the other side of the border to help fuel their own activism. We saw this very heavily in Canada, for example, looking at activity in the US after Capitol and sort of saying, okay, can we do something similar? But also actually more broadly in the online ecosystems these groups and individuals occupy. So Canada made the step of prescribing the Proud Boys. But when we look at their Telegram channels, what we find is they're hugely networked with Proud Boy channels and localized Proud Boy chapters south of the border as well. They're occupying the same spaces online. They're talking the same language. They're sharing the same materials. So I would really just mirror Heidi's point there, that there is sort of great flows of influence and also sort of cooperation, which we're seeing in the online space between the two countries. And more broadly, to Heidi's points, in terms of talking about borders, I think if you look particularly English-speaking extremist activity online, particularly in some of these Telegram channels, it is just hugely transnational, right? People don't care where you're from as long as you're part of the movement. When we're looking at white supremacy, the point there being is you're not necessarily fighting for white people in America or white people in Canada. You're fighting for, in inverted commas, ethnic Europeans globally. And that's really the narrative which these groups have built, that there is a global struggle for the white race, and you are either on the side of the white race or you are against them. And it doesn't really matter if there is sort of a threat to the white race in Sweden or a threat to the white race in Germany or the threat to the white race in the US, because for these people, that's all part of the same struggle and all part of the same battle. And that's what inspires them. So if you look at the Christchurch attacker and the phrases he had written on his gun, right? He wrote for Rotherham. It's a town in the north of England, which has had issues with child sexual exploitation. This person was positioning himself as a soldier on behalf of the white race globally. And I think that that's really, really important to underscore when you think about sort of the transnationalization of these movements.
All right, so I'm going to try and do justice to John Horgan's question here. But John, please feel free to jump in. John is asking, the scale of the online problem is staggering. Might we be forgiven for expecting even more attacks than we actually see? He notes that there are lots of plots that are fortunately disrupted before attacks, but are there additional barriers to action that we know about? What's preventing more attacks?
Well, I hate to keep talking first, Jacob, if you want to take this before me.
I think my point here would be that we are seeing, at least globally, a fairly staggering scale of attacks and a sort of significantly increasing number of attacks year on year. And if you look at the overall proportion of those in the US, you will see that that these ideologies inspire a majority of attacks. So I wouldn't want to downplay the volume which we're currently seeing, be those in terms of foiled plots or actually committed things, because it is fairly staggering. I mean, having said that, and I think, Heidi, this might be something which you could come in on as well. On the one hand, the way that these plots are defined and addressed, I think might come into it as well. So whether or not an attack is defined as, murder, for example, as opposed to a terrorist incident, I think also comes into it, because there is, I think, a large volume of violence and of committed attack, of foiled attacks out there.
Yeah, look, I agree with you, Jacob, but I think the numbers show that, well, you actually showed some of these numbers right at the beginning in your presentation. It shows that the number of these attempted attacks, at least, just have been rising and rising and rising by right-wing extremists over recent years. I mean, there have been 3 foiled attacks since January 6th. A Texas guy who wanted to blow up a Walmart, another Texas guy who wanted to blow up an Amazon, I think, cloud services system in Virginia, and one other that's escaping my mind. But I mean, these are serious things. Luckily, they've been foiled, but I don't think there's anything in these trend lines that's going to change. And if anything, as people emerge out of lockdown, it might make the world a little bit more precarious in terms of the violence that could come. And there was also January 6th. Let's not forget that happened. I don't know how many vehicle ramming attacks happened during BLM protests, but it was sizable. So unfortunately, I think the future bodes the same. And, really what's driving at least the white supremacist part of this movement are changing demographics. And that's not going to change. Those demographics are going to continue moving into, where we have a more diverse democracies, both in the US and in Europe and other places. And that's going to be the primary motive for these kinds of people and for their ideas.
All right. I'm going to ask this question from Doug Bryant, but I'm also going to let you punt it to our next panel if you prefer. Doug notes that the US doesn't have domestic terrorism laws that are analogous to our international terrorism laws. So there's no material support in the same functionality that you have for international terrorism, for example. And he asked, does Canada have domestic terrorism laws that have proven useful that the US might learn from? For example, Canada has obviously taken some actions recently to list domestic terrorism organizations that would be problematic with respect to the First Amendment here in the United States. So we're dealing in different legal contexts, but anything we can learn from Canada in this respect?
So I'll come in here both, I think, on Canada, but also the UK, who've both taken steps to prescribe white supremacist and extreme right-wing groups in recent years. Now, I think that that is some positive movement for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, it, I think, shows and publicly advertises willingness by the government that they are taking these threats seriously. They give powers to law enforcement to disrupt organization, and I think that they have been effective at doing so. We've seen that in the UK with a whole range of arrests over the past couple of years for individuals involved in violent white supremacist action. But I don't think that prescription can be seen as the be-all and end-all when addressing these threats. And for that reason, I want to bring it back to the sort of post-organizational dynamic. Now, what we're seeing increasingly are, very highly atomized terrorist threats coming from individuals who are loosely organizing online on platforms such as Telegram, for example. As Heidi said, not card-carrying members of a movement, What that means is, on the one hand, prescription isn't going to capture a whole bunch of these people who aren't necessarily affiliated. When you look at the group dynamics as well, what you'll see is they're often atomized. So they will come into formation, but they will split, and you will have analog groups appearing. What that means is, if you're going purely with prescription, you have a bit of a whack-a-mole going on. You'll knock one group in the head, and then another one will pop up to fill its space. In the UK, we had this where we prescribed a group which had formally disbanded 6 months previous, right? So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I think prescription has a place, and obviously it's challenging to implement that in the US, but I think has been effective elsewhere. But based on the current dynamics which we're seeing, it can't be the only solution. And I think we need to get more creative in terms of thinking, okay, how are we criminalizing this activity and how are we responding to this activity?
All right, so I'm going to combine 2 questions into our final question for this panel. We had one question submitted in advance that was, how do you recognize recruiting on online platforms such as gaming, chat, and posts? What can college campuses do to address this? And I'm going to save the second half of that question because that's even more complicated. And then Jim Marley asked in our chat, online social media can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it makes us more visible, but on the other hand, it allows these groups to recruit. And so Jim's question is there any risk as we try and shut down some of these activity on the mainstream platforms of driving this activity underground?
I'm going to take it in reverse. The question about driving activity underground, which I think actually relates to the first part of this question. You know, it's not as though these people disappear from the internet because the Proud Boys are banned on Facebook. That's just not what's happening. And it's also not that they're driven down into some dark web where you can't see them at all. I mean, Jacob just did a massive analysis of Telegram channels, which most certainly featured individuals who had been thrown off the mainstream platforms. For me, what's important about the mainstream platforms is it reduces the number of people that you can recruit from the mainstream. It doesn't mean you can't still recruit on places like Facebook. I mean, I'm sorry, places like Telegram, but your audience numbers are fewer, which I think matters just in general with prevention. I should also add that we know that deplatforming, whether that's of white supremacist groups or something like ISIS and whatnot, really does have a suppressive effect on the amount of propaganda and the amount of recruitment that happens. So we should always keep that in mind as important. And then the first part of the question was about signs of recruitment. You know, the truth is there's quite a bit of research out there of what recruitment looks like online, how people are enticed to these ideas, what pulls them in for various kinds of extremist movements. And I just, suggest to look at that. And unfortunately, if you're worried about prevention, you have to take a little trip down Telegram lane to see what these things look like, right? You have to experience a little bit about what is really a horror show to see how people are sucked into these movements.
And then we've got one final question that jumped in, and Jacob, you can answer this at the same time. Can anyone comment on the influence of foreign state actors on these different groups?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, I'll just completely reiterate what Heidi said. Social media lowers the barrier for entry to extremist movements, right? You don't have to go to a weird bookshop or the back room of a bar to get involved. You can get involved from the safety of comfort of your own home. And I think we need to raise that bar. And I think that deplatforming and adopting in robust terms of service around extremist activity are essential. And we know it works. The data points towards it limiting the reach of these groups, and extremists tell us it works because they get annoyed. If you think back to like Milo, right, a few years ago, he went from having an audience of millions on Twitter down to having an audience of a few thousand on Telegram, and he was so annoyed by that. And he goes, "What's the point of me continuing to do this? Because I'm not reaching the same people. I'm not having the same impact." Absolutely limit this as much as you can. In terms of the foreign state influence, the piece of this, yes. we can attest to this, and I think that there has been some really strong work done over the past few years around particularly sort of Russian disinformation activity and the impact that has. And essentially the point about disinformation and how it works is it polarizes debate. It finds wedge issues, issues which are going to polarize communities, and then it drives into that wedge. And those influence operations are really, really effective at capitalizing on that, because they amplify, they fan the flames of the grievances which these groups can then prey on in their recruitment. And I think that that's something which we've seen now for a number of years. I think it is important to say, though, when we talk about influence operations, disinformation, this isn't just foreign states. It's not just Russia doing this. It's not just China doing this. And we're starting to see this get picked up. And those same tactics, that same Putin playbook, be deployed very effectively by hate groups, by extremist actors, but also increasingly by our own political actors as well. And I think that that's a really concerning piece. So when we talk about influence operations, I think that the foreign state discussion has to go hand in hand with discussion about where those tactics are getting picked up more broadly.
All right. Please join me in thanking both Heidi and Jacob for a very illuminating discussion. We're going to transition now into our next panel. This panel is the panel on promising practices for preventing white supremacist and anti-government violence. And I'm going to invite John McCoy from the Organization for the Prevention of Violence in Canada to kick us off. John, please.
Thank you very much, Brett. I'm just going to share my screen here. And so I'll be thank you. I'll be speaking a little bit about the creation of a psychosocial intervention program in Canada that is known as Evolve, and some of our early program data that we have drawn from the program that will touch specifically our experience with the far right, or what we refer to in Canada as ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE. Just really quickly to give some context on the Canadian experience, P/CVE became a formal area of programming in Canada around 2015. Think about the global context, all the pressure around the FBF phenomenon at the time, the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon at the time. The Liberal government, which came into power in that year under Justin Trudeau, put $35 million US over 5 years, P/CVE, and $10 million ongoing. In 2017, 2018, Canada comes out with a national strategy and establishes the Canada Centre at Public Safety Canada, which is essentially the body that's responsible for capacity building and monitoring of programs. And what this really equates into is something that matches with the population and geography of Canada, where you have the second largest country in the world, most of the population living along the American border, very spread out. And the idea was there's a need for bespoke, tailored local programming that could respond to the unique needs of specific municipalities, provinces, and regions. In terms of our own program and how we developed, we took a long time to develop the Evolve program. We spent 1.5 years. And this was really primarily a time of research and stakeholder engagement. We conducted more than 350 interviews for during the program development period, and that was with the law enforcement, human service, and community sectors. And what I'll highlight out of this, because I think it was increasingly important for what was to come with Evolve, was 2 elements for our development. One was identifying reputable and experienced practitioners. The most important piece of advice that we received at the outset of creating Evolve was from Cecile Rousseau at McGill in Montreal. And Cecile basically said to us, the clients are very complex, and you need experienced people to do this work if you want it to go well. And I think that's proven to be very true for us. The second piece of the development that was important, and I think particularly applicable to working with the far right, was identifying existing grassroots community-based programs or ad hoc programs that were operating in Western Canada at the time. So specifically, we brought in a imam who was working at a mosque that had been impacted by what we refer to as the extremist traveler phenomenon here in Canada, and two former white supremacists who have been working with the Life After Hate Network. And these individuals have proven to be very important to the relative success of our program. So Evolve was launched in April 2019. It's a specialized program. In other words, we're not working on a host of other criminal or social problems. We're working on violent extremism. We're specialized in that particular area of work and focused on the ideological element, which differentiates that area of work from other areas of crime prevention. And it's a multidisciplinary program. So it's composed of social workers. We have a younger junior social worker with an MSW and an older social worker with more than 20 years experience. A forensic psychologist, 20 years experience in corrections, working primarily with violent offenders. He's proven particularly important in terms of conducting risk assessments. And then these mentors, and this includes some area experts, includes formers, and it includes the imam that I referenced earlier. I'm going to skip this slide for the sake of time and get right into some of our early program data. So as you can see, we're currently working with 35 individuals in the program. A good portion of that are family members, about 10 to 12 are family members. The rest are individuals who are directly involved. And we saw a really sustained increase in referrals in the first quarter of 2020 in a way that really neatly coincided with the implementation of harsher or stricter public health measures here in Canada. I'm not going to have time to get into that, but I'm happy to speak to that. This is a chart that shows 2 years of referrals. Just for our American peers here, please note that IMVE stands for ideologically motivated violent extremism, and that captures the far right primarily in Canada. RMVE is not racially motivated violent extremism in Canada. It is religiously motivated violent extremism, and it primarily captures ISIS and Al-Qaeda inspired individuals. But as you can see again from this chart, starting around that first quarter, March, April 2020, we saw that sustained increase in referrals related to the far right coming into the program. Another interesting tidbit of data is where they're coming from, and I think this sort of takes us back full circle to that those early slides on program development, because what we've seen is that only 12% of our referrals are coming from what I would refer to as traditional sources of referral for P/TV programs, government or national security sources. We're seeing a vast majority coming from the community and human service sector. And I think that goes to show the importance of the stakeholder engagement that we conducted early on, but also the integration of those grassroots elements that would prove important for us accessing individuals at risk. Another interesting tidbit from the early data that we have is what are their needs and what are the services we're actually delivering to these individuals, the lighter color being those who are involved with the far right. As you can see, clinical counseling is the most popular. So what this tells us is that counseling is something that participants want, but also having in-house mental health supports, having our psychologists has proven to be very important, and looking at other programs that have not had in-house mental health supports have had to rely on external entities where psychologists or psychiatrists might be quite busy, you get on a wait list. This really can slow down the progress of programs. And I think it shows again, the importance of having in-house. The second most important need is mentoring, that mentorship piece. These participants, they have questions about ideology, but also they have questions about the experience of leaving these groups and what disengagement looks like for individuals. And I think that sort of empathetic understanding from formers has been particularly important. Other participant needs, other services will look familiar to practitioners in other areas, maybe even involved in areas like homelessness, because we do see things like food security, housing, basic needs pop up with this population. Really quickly, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but you can see some differences in the needs of those who are directly involved with extremism and the family members of those who are involved in extremism. And here they do have questions about ideology and ideological involvement and group involvement. That's the mentoring piece, but also are looking for advocacy. So for example, advocacy of return for individuals who are currently in prison camps in Syria and Iraq. Okay, just to sum up, and I'm sure I'm already over my 7 minutes, so I'll make it quick. Just some early lessons in terms of working with the far right that I think might be useful here. Again, the importance of that early and ongoing community and stakeholder engagement piece. This is something that I think really set the ground for us to receive referrals from non-traditional sources and for us to access legitimate risk in the space. The second is this sort of answering of a long-standing question for me at the outset of this enterprise in relation to P/CV, because it seemed quite clear, and it seems quite clear for a number of programs, that community engagement around religiously motivated violent extremism might involve engagement with newcomer and religious minority communities, rightly or wrongly. And I think that's, of course, a point of debate, how that community engagement should take place. But how do you engage with the white community? How do you engage with the community that's originating the problem of white supremacy? And the answer, I think, is actually fairly clear. It's certainly not free of hazards, and I'm happy to talk about that. But the formers have created a community. They've created a community where individuals who have an empathetic experience or understanding of individuals who want to leave these movements can provide practical advice. And that is something that the clients, that the service participants really want. They want to talk about ideology. They want to talk about the experience of people who got out, stayed out, and sustained their disengagement over a long period of time. And these formers are not only acting as a conduit for that exit, they're also offering an in-demand service, and that's mentorship. Now, again, this is not an area that is free of hazard or risk. Working with formers, we believe the way in which we've dealt with this risk, not necessarily entirely effectively, but in a way that has maintained the professionalization of our program, is to professionalize these individuals, to offer them training, to embed them in a program that has social workers and psychologists and others who they can benefit from that knowledge and professional understanding. So I think that for us, that's worked. That has proven to be a way in which we can access this quote unquote community in Western Canada and indeed beyond. But I'm out of time. I'll leave it there, and thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Jem. We really appreciate it. Next up, I want to turn it over to Sarah Wenger. Sarah is the brand new director of Exit USA. Sarah, please.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you for having me. And yes, I am brand new, so please forgive me as I may not have the depth of knowledge and experience as many of the people on this panel, but my name is Sarah Weiniger-Budge. I am a psychologist and the program director of Exit USA at Life After Hate. Life After Hate is a grassroots program that was founded in 2011 by former violent extremists who realized that their own exit from violent extremism would have been made smoother if they had had support from peers who had been there before and access to resources. So Exit USA is one of our sub-programs, and it's modeled after Exit Sweden, but adapted to our culture and our population. About 60% of our clients are individuals who are actively involved in the violent far right or are recently disengaged. And we have a range of services to offer these clients. The first is our direct intervention service in Exit USA. So our clients are paired with an exit specialist. This is a former. This person has been extensively vetted and trained by our staff and is supervised directly by a licensed clinical social worker. So the exit specialist acts much like John was describing as a mentor, much like a sponsor in AA might. The clients are also paired with a case manager. These are licensed social workers who may work directly with the client or work indirectly through the exit specialist to identify and connect the client with resources they might need to aid them in leaving the movement. So this could be things like alcohol and drug treatment, housing support, domestic violence services very commonly, and of course, psychotherapy. So we're not directly challenging their ideology. Instead, we're using motivational interviewing and trauma-informed care to address 3 primary targets for intervention, and all of these are interrelated. So we're really focused on safety, safety, of course, of society, and hoping to prevent any kind of acts of violence, but safety of the individual who is trying to disengage, redeveloping an identity that isn't fused with violent extremism, and changing their affiliation or their belonging networks. We also provide access to a variety of online forums where people in various stages of exiting violent extremism can find and give support to their peers. There's different levels of forum access that are granted as people move through the program, and the exit forums are staffed by formers, but they are supervised by the clinical staff. They address safety, affiliation, and belonging in different but complementary ways to the direct intervention services. And many of the formers that I've talked to, both currently in our program and outside, really express how important these forums were as creating a new online environment, since many of them spent a lot of time in that outrage machine of the violent extremist online network. This replaces that network for them. And these forums provide ongoing support for people as they leave the movement, and they consistently return to them even long after they've disengaged. And finally, we are trying constantly to build a network of community resources and referrals to address the needs of our clients. These are the things that John also spoke to, the challenges we have of finding therapists who could provide pro bono, sliding fee scale, services, or potentially bill insurance if the individuals have resources. We also find that our clients need basic life skills. This could be things like how to create a budget or manage your personal finances. And there are some needs specific to our population, such as how do you talk about your criminal history in a job interview? What do you do when your new coworkers find out about your past violent extremism? So as I said, about 60% of our clients are self-referred individuals who are involved or recently disengaged from the far-right movements, but about 40% of our clients are family and friends who are looking for help and support when dealing with a loved one who is involved in a violent movement. So our friends and family clients are paired with a case manager and an exit specialist as well. However, in this case, they're providing education, connection with supportive services, again, that's that case manager role, and specific skills for dealing with these challenging relationships. It's hard to love someone who is involved in an anger and hate at this level, and violence, of course. We also offer a weekly virtual support group for families that's run by a network of parents whose children have disengaged. And we have forums that are specifically for family and friends. So all of these services address 3 targets for intervention with our families. It's providing that social support network and reducing isolation for these families that are grappling with violent loved ones, building and maintaining hope that their loved one could change, but also providing realistic expectations about how long this might take and what the change process actually looks like. Again, in these services, we are not directly challenging ideology, and we are not training families to conduct some kind of intervention. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is provide these families and friends the scaffolding that they need to maintain as much positive connection to their loved ones in these movements, so that if and when the loved one decides to leave, they have a relationship to land in. Having that sense of affiliation and belonging, we know, is so important for our individual clients, and we really want to build those social networks or maintain them for them so that that person has a place to go to if they decide to leave. But frankly, sometimes the best we can do with families is just help them not make it worse, not further polarize their loved one. So that is just a brief overview of our Exit USA services. We have other programs and initiatives running, but in the direct service realm, I will echo some of the things that John already described and the things that we have learned. The first, and this cannot be stressed enough, is that the combination of appropriately vetted and trained formers with licensed professionals working together under a clear set of standards is essential. I think we can all imagine why it would be problematic to have just anyone identify as a former, put up a shingle, start up a website, and offer their services as a former. But we also have found, much as John said, that the insights and the contributions of the farmers in our organization on our staff are invaluable to our program development and to our ability to really reach and respond to the needs that are out there. The second thing that we have realized is that the organization has to be nimble. As the threat landscape changes, as new needs arise, we have to adapt and act. And so we need to address these emerging needs using tools and resources that may be adapted from related fields, such as my own, of course, assess the effectiveness or the response that our clients have to this, and then adjust accordingly. However, these things, of course, lead to some challenges. While we are using evidence-based interventions that are validated with other populations, we don't have adequate research on these interventions with this population. So we really need to be developing a menu of empirically validated interventions, working with the violent far right and white supremacist groups and anti-government groups. The second, and again, John spoke to this, just in an indirect way, it is very difficult to find farmers to work in this space who are healthy and stable and interested in the level of self-reflection and self-examination that it takes to do this work. And related to that is our constant concern about whether we are providing adequate support to them. And specifically, are we providing adequate mental health support for our farmers? Our farmers have their own trauma. We know that people who engage in violent extremism frequently have a history of adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, history of trauma. They also experience trauma in these movements. And in this process, they are being asked to relive their own traumas, but they're also experiencing this vicarious traumatization in helping others and hearing about others' experience in the movement. And so we're very mindful of how important it is to be appropriately supporting and vetting our farmers. The next issue we have, and John spoke to this as well, the gift of having an in-house therapist. We don't necessarily have that gift right now. We are constantly looking for enough culturally competent therapists around the United States and internationally who are willing to work with this population. Frankly, many therapists feel like they don't know how to work with this population and they find the ideology quite egregious and don't want to work with the population. We have attempted to address this with our mental health professionals co-responder training, where we provide that cultural competency training. We talk about motivational interviewing strategies specific to this population, trauma-informed care specific to our population, and how to interface with the Life After Hate resources. The final issue we have is that we are working with people who are self-referred. So John spoke to the referral sources. We're really finding people who find us on their own. That's who comes to us. So they demonstrate at least some awareness that there's something maladaptive in their beliefs and their social network and their behaviors. So there might be just a kernel of willingness to change. So using a stages of change model, what we see is that most of the people we're working with are in the contemplation stage, the preparation stage, or the action stage where they're actually making changes in their life. But we're not addressing people who are pre-contemplative. These are the people who would say, I don't have a problem, and typically would add, you're the problem. There are interventions from other fields that are designed that are in conjunction with motivational interviewing to address people in the pre-contemplative stage, but we're just not doing that yet. And I'm not sure how we as an organization would address that population. I have a sense that redirect campaigns and mass media campaigns could have an impact here, but the messaging is going to be key. We really run the risk of further polarizing and feeding those outrage machines that exist in these movements. So that is just a very quick and brief overview of our services, and I look forward to taking questions later.
Thank you for that, Sarah. We really appreciate it. And our final panelist on this panel is Christopher Kick. Christopher is with the Violence Prevention Network out of Germany. Christopher, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for the organization. And I have a question before I start. How much time do I have left?
We're going with 7 minutes, and we'll take a little bit from the discussion time to give you your full 7 minutes.
Okay. I try to do my very best. So where is the presentation? Yep, sharing my screen with you. So, no, that's not the first one. Not work. Sorry, the technique isn't doing exactly what I want. Now you should see my presentation. Is it right? Okay.
Yes.
Good. So my name is Christopher Keek. I work for Violence Prevention Network since 10 years as a practitioner, and especially with right-wing extremists. Our clients mostly are violent extremist offenders. And I do also workshops for use as risk of radicalization and further education with a focus of awareness building for professionals. And all of this I'm doing not in English. So today it's a little bit challenging for me, but I hope we will get along. So I give you a quick overview when now it doesn't want. Why not? Yeah, now a quick overview about Violence Prevention Network. It's an NGO and that is experienced in working in prevention of extremism, intervention and de-radicalization. It's a non-profit organization based in Germany. And we are experienced in this field for over 17 years of practical experience. And inside and outside of prison, the pilot project of Violence Prevention Network was starting in a youth prison, and there we gained the most experience from. And through the work with right-wing extremists, also including counseling for parents and relatives and professionals as well. So let's give a quick overview. Different approaches and different target groups. Important for the prevention is a basic immunization against radicalization, workshops in schools and youth centers, or awareness buildings, as I said before, of professionals like teachers, police, prison staff, school, or social exit workers. So and the intervention, it's for people who are more involved or beginning to radicalize, and they have more ideological thought patterns. And there it's that we activate the distancing process from extremist mindsets and violent behavior through training for groups, also for trainings for individuals in and outside prison or detention centers. De-radicalization is disengagement and de-radicalization processes through training and counseling with more or less highly radicalized people in and outside prisons. And this includes as well counseling of parents, relatives, and professionals. So, and our method is called Education of Responsibility, Verantwortungspädagogik. And our method is dialogue-based, respectful and non-degrading approach. And for us, voluntariness is important, but it doesn't have to be at the beginning of the process, because in prison, as you will guess, it's difficult. We have to build a stable relationship, and with this often comes voluntariness. Our work is process-oriented and with an individual procedure. And we're using a systemic approach like resource and solution-oriented and inclusion of social environment. The aim of this is the change of behavior and mindset. We're working with goals, identifying and addressing ambivalence and doubt. This is very important for me because, as you know, extremists or violent extremist offenders. They are more like it's black or white, it's enemy or friend, it's you know, and no shades of gray. And there it's our task with them to see how can we identify and address their ambivalences, because they don't show it from the beginning. Yeah, and for another aim is developing personal independence and self-responsibility, because it's very important that they say, okay, that they can see for what they have done, that they are responsible, and that is often a long way to go. Yeah, then some examples for our program elements is what I already said, work with goals. So inner motivation to undergo change process is very important. Biographical work, realizing experiences of disintegration and disappointment. This is very important often for the clients, that they can see that their violent behavior and their thinking structures are in line of what they experienced before. Then political education, so understanding personal motivation of logical thinking structures is very important, and resource and future work. So most of our clients can't see anything that they have done good, or that they have resources. They have the stories of criminals or of violent extremist offenders. So it's very important that they recognize inner resources for the undergoing change of perspective towards their courses of action. Then detailed analysis and critical reflection of criminal offense is a basic element for our work. And what I like very much as well is that we more or less often are able to use sports pedagogy for anti-violence work, like team building and transferring learnings into practice. So in sports, we can see how they go along with fair play and stuff like this. Okay, that's the next doesn't want, but it says thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Christopher. Now is our time for Q&A. So please, again, populate your questions in the chat. And perfect, thank you. And go ahead and turn your videos and cameras on if you can. I am going to kick off with some of the questions we received in advance. So one of the questions we already got some answers to this from both John and Sarah, but how should we include formers in our interventions? So thank you for that. Next question, what is the best way to educate teens about how to prevent white supremacy and anti-government threats? John, go ahead.
I'm not sure if I have a satisfactory answer here. I can talk about what we're currently doing as a project, which is really a youth-led project in secondary schools here in Edmonton. And you know, the idea I think underlying it, which is theory rather than theory really grounded in evidence, is that if youth can deliver awareness and training programs to youth themselves, they're more receptive than if it would come from ourselves or from police officers or someone showing up at a school and giving a bit of a lecture. So what we've done in our own program is to work with a group of high school students to first look at, we conducted a survey with 800 youth looking at the ways in which they've been exposed or interacted to extremism and hate online. And then among themselves to use that data to come up with presentations that they could offer in schools that are youth-led but supported. Instinctually, we think that's the way to go, but do we have evidence to back it up? We do not.
Jan, we can follow up online. We've got some programs that came out of our Invent to Prevent initiative that may be of interest to you. So our next question comes from Malia. How do you encourage referrals from family, friends, and other members who may care about someone they love and want to seek help? Sarah, jump in on this, and then Christopher will follow up with you.
Right, I would be happy to. So in our case, again, as I said, we are really working on strengthening those relationships with the family members and friends so that there is we would say a pro-social or non-violent relationship that person is still connected to, so that the only messaging they're getting isn't just coming from the group and the movement, it's also coming from someone outside of that movement. And in that case, we aren't necessarily encouraging the family to directly provide a referral, although if the individual ever at any time expresses that moment of hesitation or doubt, that we can talk to the family and friends and say, you know, here, when you hear these things, when you hear that ambivalence that Christopher was referring to as well, ambivalence about the movement or ambivalence about a conspiracy theory and so on, you know, there are people who have been through this before, and they might, you might really find some interesting information from this. I know of this organization called Life After Hate. They have people who were involved in these movements available to talk to you. And so that is where the experience and that peer mentorship of our exit specialists, the formers, is essential. But it is a touchy line, because the challenge is, how do we encourage somebody to change who does not want to change and who is in that pre-contemplative stage of change. And so, as I said, there are some interventions that we can do with that, but it is challenging and it requires a very light and sensitive touch.
And Christopher?
Yeah, what we do as well is that we share our knowledge, what is normal for people who radicalize themselves, and what can they expect in a relationship, so that they know, okay, it's not my fault, it's not the fault of anybody else, that is a normal relationship, and that they Sarah said before, that they can share their thoughts, that they can share their insights, that they have somebody to talk. That could be very encouraging, and also that they know that if they are strong enough, to do not quit the relationship, that at the end it can be very, very important for the change of the people, that there was someone who never gave up.
Okay, thank you. Doug Bryant asks a question that I know comes up often. Is there a point at which you take on this disinformation and conspiracy theories with counter arguments, or is that strategy best avoided? John, go ahead.
I think it's case dependent, and the most essential feature of the intervention process, and I think both Sarah and Christopher mentioned this, is you need to build that trusting relationship, a professional trusting relationship at the outset. And once that trusting relationship is developed, then there may be opportunities to discuss ideology, belief systems, and indeed what we're finding is that that's a common desire for these service participants. They want to talk about it. And then I believe the formers, the psychologists, they're doing the right thing, which is to encourage critical thinking around these beliefs. And that's not a process that's an overnight process. It takes time. And I don't know if this is a little off topic, but you know, I really, you need to think about the way in which, for us, we've been thinking about the way in which the far right frames its enemy today, frames the other in group out group dynamics. They have this sense of crisis related to the Great Replacement or what have you. They define their enemy primarily, and I think this differentiates the ones that we're seeing today from, say, white supremacists of the 2000s, 90s, and 80s as the political left. Maybe they frame it as Antifa. So they're really used to those sort of points of argumentation online and looking to be, you know, looking for those triggers. So I think you have to avoid that and instead look at ways in which you can introduce gray areas and black and white dichotomous thinking. And again, that can only be done in the context of relationship based on trust, and from that a sort of reverse cognitive opening. You know, we talk about cognitive opening to radicalization, a cognitive opening to a discussion on de-radicalization.
Christopher, please.
I would say it also depends on the setting where you are, because in family discussions or in open space, and you are there's someone who is like with a racist behavior, then might be very important that everybody in this discussion get to know that there are other people with other opinions. And when we speak of what John does, of really professional work with radicalized people, then often it is like this, that first we want a stable relationship, and then it does not last long. They ask my opinion. They want to know my opinion. And then we said I gained the right to intervene. And then it makes very much sense to do so. And there can be in this process also a phase where they need like, you know, like an argument, yeah. And when the relationship is stable enough, we can do this.
Can I just add one really quick thing as a hot fault, because I think it relates to John Horgan's question a little bit. And sorry, sir, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I'll make it really quick. One other interesting finding that we've had from individuals who have come in is they've often been exposed to counseling previously with psychologists, but the psychologists either don't want to talk about ideology, they're kind of uncomfortable, or they'll deflect or they'll pathologize. And I think that is one issue you're seeing quite frequently, is psychologists, they're just not familiar with it, right? They're not getting the training, they're not getting the education, they're not getting the experience. So I think that really shows, you know, the importance of that ideological element and the importance of individuals who can answer questions around that. Sorry again, Sarah.
No, that's quite all right. I actually just wanted to amplify everything that both John and Christopher said in response to the question about directly challenging ideology. What we're really looking for is to ask questions rather than a direct challenge. And if you can imagine for yourself, if you have a deeply held belief in something and someone says, well, you're wrong, and let me tell you why you're wrong, you're not going to be receptive to that. But if I can ask you these open-ended questions and really elicit your ambivalence, then within, and exactly what Christopher and John are saying, in that trusting relationship with that alliance, where we can have that critical discourse around the ideology, then we have the right environment. And I also wanted to respond to John Horgan's question about where are my mental health folks at? where are the psychologists and the social workers and the folks that are trained in this? And again, would echo what John is saying, that we do have a lot of clients who have had either experiences they found unsatisfying, where individuals, therapists were not able to have that kind of discourse with them, or frankly that were problematic and have turned them off from therapy. And so that is where that cultural competency piece has become so important. And again, we have that mental health co-responder training that we offer multiple times a year. And what I would love to see is more people in my field that are involved in this work. And, you know, to expand more on what I think the challenges are, I think it's that they don't know how to talk about this. I think that folks in my profession are worried about the risk. They're not sure how to manage that risk. They feel like this is this animal that we don't understand. You know, I might be able to understand this non-ideological criminal violence, but I can't understand this ideological violence. And so sometimes it's a matter of translating the this experience and this population into known entities and experience and frameworks that they can understand this work in. And so again, that's what we're trying to do with that co-responder training program.
Does anyone else want to speak to my favorite question ever, which is how do we get more psychologists and social workers involved? It's the whole point of this network. John, Christopher?
Maybe I could say some from a German perspective, because it's the same. It's the same here, that you know, they are professionals in their field, yeah, and then a topic like ideology comes up and they don't feel professional anymore. And what we do, as Sarah and John said before, is that we remember them, that they are the professionals, that they are in charge, and that they don't have to be a radicalization expert in speaking with people who have ideological thinking structures. There might be a point where they need help, or where they can get professional counseling. Why not? But in most cases, it's not really necessary.
Right, thank you, Christopher. John, did you want to jump in on that one, or should we move to the next question?
I just really briefly to say, you know, I think the interest is there from psychologists themselves. When, you know, I have a discussion with someone in the field about what we're doing, there's always a level of interest, but that, again, that lack of familiarity is a problem. Can there be specialized training at your university, John? I don't know. But yeah, I think that the interest is there, but just the training is largely absent, or the knowledge of the availability of training is absent.
And to incorporate Jim Marley's point, not just for psychologists, but for social workers as well. All right, so next question, very common question from Greg. Are there any connections to lessons learned for helping individuals leave cults that transcend to this issue?
I would be happy to take that. Absolutely, there are. We find a lot of parallels between people who are seeking new religious movements or cults and people who are seeking identity and belonging and meaning from violent far-right movements. And so the needs that are being met for personal significance, for belonging, and so on are met simply by different sides of the same coin, essentially a non-violent version versus a violent version. And so what we see is that, again, it is that development, as I said, the 3 pillars that we focus on being safety foremost. And then, of course, that affiliation and belonging is really important. If you're finding your affiliation and your belonging in a cult, you're finding your affiliation, belonging, and identity in a violent extremist group, then what we need to do is shift that affiliation and belonging to a nonviolent group, shift your identity to a nonviolent identity, or to maybe a more complex identity, rather than being completely fused with this identity as a far-right extremist. We now have multiple identities that are valued in you, and social identities. I'm a parent, I am a sibling, I am an employee in this particular field, and so on. And it gives this greater sense of meaning outside of that group, so that they can let go of that, much in the same way that a person would need leaving a new religious movement.
Other questions? We have about 8 more minutes for questions with this panel. And if you have questions for the last panel that you didn't get a chance to ask, that's okay too. So one of the questions we received in advance is, how do we increase community awareness without raising fear? And especially in an education setting. Christopher, do you want to jump in on this first? I know some of your programming is community awareness raising.
Can you repeat it for me? I don't know if I get it.
How do you increase community awareness without making people fearful, with taking a fear-mongering approach to it?
I would say one point is that more transparent dialogue is an answer for less fear, because if there are more myths, or that there are false information, or you are not really good informed, that is what mostly creates fear. But if you have a good knowledge and good discussions, it's more easy. But also we have to say, in Germany as well as a society, we have increased number of right-wing extremists. And when people say, oh, what is the right word? I don't like this direction it goes, yeah, then okay, you can deny it, but you also can show what actions NGOs and other social actors and government actors do, and that most people, even if it is increasing, most people think different, and that is important for people.
All right, so Doug Bryant asked the question, and this ties into one of the questions we received in advance as well. Why is this such a problem in the military? But more importantly, so I'm going to let Heidi and Jacob jump in on that if they want to too. But more importantly for this panel, what can we do to support individuals who are veterans or active military? And the question we received in advance was specifically individuals who may be college students. So that's a 3-part question there. Heidi, Jacob, do either of you want to jump into why is this such a challenge for military and veterans? All right, if not, does anyone on the current panel want to jump in on that?
We're conducting some research around this right now, with interviews with individuals who have been involved in far-right movement and the military. And I'll caution you that there's not a lot of subjects to interview on this, so it's a pretty small sample. The sort of, one of the theories is that individuals go in specifically, because they're already radicalized, they go in looking for training that they can use in pursuit of the movement's goals. They go in to recruit other individuals, or they were recruited within the military itself. It's quite complex, the experiences that we've seen, including those who have actually been de-radicalized by the military, who were radicalized going in, and it was their experience in the military that began the exit process. So it's not there's no simple explanation. I know the tendency is to say it's something to do with the culture of the military. Yeah, I don't really have a satisfying answer there, other than to say that there's a diversity of experiences that we've seen in the limited research we've done so far.
We'll also note there's very targeted recruiting of individuals with military or law enforcement training. So not only do some individuals go in with those beliefs, but they may also be recruited.
Absolutely.
Their specialized training.
We have 3%ers here in Canada and in Alberta. We try to explain to them that there was no American Revolution here in Canada, but they don't seem to listen to that part. But what they were doing was they were very purposefully targeting military for recruitment. But fortunately, the dominant response of people who were targeted with recruitment was essentially, these guys are out there and there's no way we're touching them. But yeah.
Sarah, you wanted to jump in on this?
Yeah, so Pete Simi has done some research specifically on white supremacist recruitment and people who are veterans. And so there is some information out there for that population specifically. And from what I recall, he found that it was in some cases related to the way that they left the military. If they found their role in the military to be unsatisfying, and or had maybe an early release from service for a variety of reasons, even if it wasn't a dishonorable discharge, for example, that those people were at heightened risk and were more likely to become involved in white supremacist groups and violence and anti-government as well. But I think a lot of what John is speaking to is that we do need greater research into this and more information about it. Theoretically, we can see the military as this incredibly potent experience of belonging and shared meaning and identity. We are all on a team. We are working together toward this goal. It is a sacred goal of the safety and security of our nation. And now, once we have either left that or have some disillusionment with that, what is left to take the place? And so you'll be tired of me harping on the idea of identity and meaning and belonging. But when we shift from one source of identity, meaning, and belonging, what takes its place could be a violent extremist group. And it could be a pro-social movement as well. So there's clearly other factors involved in that shift into violent radicalization.
And Sarah, do you want to expand on that last point, or anyone else want to expand on that last point to answer the final part of that three-part question? How do we support college students or youth in general who are veterans and active military make that shift to pro-social as they separate from the military? John, you're smiling, so I'm going to call on you.
Sorry, I was just laughing at someone sent me a bit of humor there. So how do we prevent youth joining? Is this
how do we help youth who are transitioning out of the military, and especially in a college environment? How do we support individuals who are transitioning out of the military find those pro-social substitutes for that experience, that sense of belonging?
I don't know if I have a satisfactory answer. I mean, I think that the question would ultimately come down to what is the military doing for its veterans and what supports is it offering after service for these individuals to access veteran services, and that unfortunately I don't have enough familiarity with to answer in any sort of satisfactory manner.
All right, and there's a lot of dialogue happening in the chat, which is wonderful to see. The one point I will call out is Bev's point of how do you get more psychologists involved, answer being baby steps. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists here today, but especially this last panel, Sarah, Christopher, and John. We really appreciate all of the insights you shared. We are going to begin wrapping up here. So I'm going to invite Addie to do our post-workshop questions as I share some lessons learned, and then we'll go over next steps for this emerging network. So what did we hear today? We heard there's an increase in narratives, in resonance of white supremacist narratives in particular, including Great Replacement and white genocide narratives. We heard that there's a close interplay between nonviolent channels online that may have white supremacist ideology as their center, and then channels that call for violence. We saw that map with the close intersection between the two. We heard that there's a lot of glorification online, channels glorifying violence, channels calling for violence, and channels sharing tactical know-how, and that those can sometimes intersect and interlap in ways that can draw people further into these movements and radicalize and mobilize them toward violence. We heard that this is not unique to the United States, especially this last panel with speakers from Canada and Germany. These challenges we're seeing around the world right now, unfortunately, and you're seeing that transnational flow of influence as well. And that managing the appearance of white supremacists calls for violence on mainstream platforms can reduce the exposure to mainstream audiences. Transitioning into our second panel, we heard about the importance of building trusting and stable relationships of care with individuals whom you're providing direct services to, the importance of voluntariness in these programs, tactics such as motivational interviewing and trauma-informed care, and ensuring that both of those are used in a culturally appropriate and culturally competent way. The aim here is to understand, to identify those areas of ambivalence over time and in the context of those trusting relationships, to encourage accountability, and ultimately aim towards a change in behavior. And then finally, we heard about the importance of training and professionalizing former white supremacists and pairing them with clinical social workers, clinical psychologists, and others so that we are providing responsible care across the sector. We're about to close this post-workshop poll. And after the close of this poll, I'm going to invite Addie to share some slides for upcoming events as we build toward our network. So first, this is a QR code. Addie is also putting a link in the chat for those like me that are not as comfortable with QR codes. Please, please, please take this network preferences questionnaire. We'll also be following up with organizations directly, but we need your help. We are trying to build a network for interdisciplinary professionals who are preventing targeted violence and terrorism across the country. And we want to hear from you. in terms of what you want to see in this network, what you think membership should look like and require, and more importantly to me, what committees, if any, would you be willing to serve on as we build this network? We would like individuals to help join a membership committee and really build out the membership of this network. We're also looking for an ethics committee, programs committee, public relations, and others. So we encourage everyone to please take this questionnaire and consider joining the committees in this network. Addie, next slide. I've got an event next week, just to flag it for everyone. Many of you will know Seamus Hughes. He's the Deputy Director for the Program on Extremism at George Washington University, also a friend and colleague of mine from our government service days. He has a fantastic book titled Homegrown, ISIS in America. And we're doing a book talk next Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern for anyone who wants to join. Next slide. Today, we tackled white supremacist violence and anti-government violence. We're doing 2 more workshops in this threat series. On July 27th at the same time, we are doing involuntary celibate and misogynistic violence. And some of the people in our audience today, we will be reaching out to later today to ask to speak. On September 14th, we're looking to tackle the threat of internationally inspired terrorism and again, promising practices to prevent it. And then finally, on September 28th, this will be our last virtual workshop. We're looking at addressing the role of mis and disinformation in targeted violence. So very timely topics on the horizon. And then our last preview before we close out this workshop. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, we are planning our first in-person workshop this fall in Chicago. We do have 4-day travel scholarships available for that workshop as part of our generous grant from the Department of Homeland Security's Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. So please stay tuned for information on that fall workshop. We hope to see many of you there in person. Addie, was there anything else before we close it out?
Oh, no, I'm just going to put the QR code back up in case anyone missed it though.
Yes, again, please take this questionnaire. We really want to hear from all of you, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks at our workshop on involuntary celibate and misogynistic violence. Thank you, everyone. Bye.